Well, hello everybody. Welcome once again to Faith Fellowship Sunday School. Today we're going to turn a corner and take a look at a new, maybe short series here, learning from the life of King David. There is, just a great deal that we can learn from watching this young man develop into what God eventually wanted him to become. But like everybody else, he's going to make mistakes. But it's a lot that we can learn from the life of King David. And maybe in a 3-part series, maybe more, we'll see what we can glean from the scriptures and then apply it to life. Because there's so much information there that I think everybody who's trying to achieve in life and everybody who's going to try to strive to do better, they're going to have to learn some things about their current circumstance before God begins to elevate them. Let me give you an idea. What we'll find in the story is this, and I want to start with this so you can keep it in the back of your mind. There's always the you before God elevates you to the level that He's going to take you. And then that you, who you were once, laboring in what may have felt like obscurity, now you're in a position of power or authority, or God has elevated you. Then what will you become, and who will you become after God places you where He wants you to be? So it's an interesting journey, and I want to walk through it with you. So we're going to start looking at, the story happens to start in 1 Samuel chapter 16, which is where we'll start today. And I'm hoping, and I'm going to take this into consideration, that all of you know something about the life of King David and how he ascended to the throne as king over Israel. Remember, he wasn't always the king of Israel. There was a life before he became king. So we're going to start reading in the book of 1 Samuel chapter 16. I hope you enjoy this because there's a lot to learn about practical life and principles. So in 1 Samuel chapter 16, it starts in verse 1. The Lord said to Samuel, who was the prophet, the last judge, especially a good one, over Israel before the monarchy began, when Israel transitioned from judges and prophets to the monarchy. So it says, the Lord said to Samuel, how long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? In other words, before you get to your next level, there's probably someone above you. And there's probably someone that may be in a position that you can't move until something changes in that person's life. Now, I'm never going to promote trying to get rid of the competition. I'm never going to do that. Because remember, we're looking at life through a biblical lens where we're trying to see things through the Christian way of life. So now you see that King Saul is in the position, he's the first king over Israel. And so God's about to do something. And remember, God always has a plan. And you're in it. You just may not know it yet, as we'll see in this story. God always has a plan. Nothing happens in the life of these biblical characters without God knowing about it in advance, and nothing will happen in your life without God knowing about it in advance. The question is, what are you doing where you are? What are you doing in your current situation in life? Let me give you an example of that. It's called blooming where you're planted. See, many times people, they're always looking to the next level and not really developing where they are. They're always looking ahead, that ambition in them, that sometimes selfish ambition in them, causes them to have very little appreciation for where God may have them right now. What I would like all of you to do, as well as myself, is to learn some things from King David. Well, before he was king, that he bloomed where he was planted. Right where he was content with that position, that station in his life. And remember, if you gotta cheat, lie, and scheme your way up, then you're not doing it God's way. God knew the obstacle in front of David because God appointed him. His name was Saul. He was the first king of Israel. God knew full well David would never rise to the kingship as long as Saul was the king, because he's not going to install two in that way. So wherever you are in your life right now, whatever station you're in, please work at being content with your current circumstance. God knows exactly where you are. In fact, I'm going to read a psalm to you that I want you to understand. Now, the eyes of men and people, they may not be paying attention to us. We may feel like we're laboring in obscurity. We may feel like nobody sees me. Nobody recognizes what I do. No one understands how much I go through and the things I'm trying to do to be seen to rise to the next level. I'm going to tell you something. People may never really take note of your talents or your abilities. They may not even care. But you got to remember something about who is watching, and that's God. He's always watching over us. Listen to what it says in Psalm 34. I'm going to start reading in verse 11. Come, my children, listen to me. I will teach you the fear of the Lord. Whoever of you loves life and desires to see many good days, keep your tongue from evil. So wherever you are, whatever station in life you are, you might feel like you're laboring in obscurity. But he says, if you want to enjoy this life, if you want to advance in this life, wherever you are, keep your tongue from evil. Don't backbite the person ahead of you. Don't try to eliminate the competition around you. Don't do that. Remember, this is Christianity we're talking about. We're not talking about worldly tactics. We're talking about Christianity. So it says, keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking lies. So now, sometimes in order to get ahead, we have to cut the other guy down in front of us. Well, that's because we think that we have to make a showing to men instead of to God. Remember, we live to please God and not men. So wherever you are, whatever station you're in life, find contentment. That doesn't mean you don't have aspirations for greater achievements. That means wherever God has you, find contentment right there. Then it says, turn from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. It's going to look odd, you pursuing peace with your competition, or you're going to feel a little awkward when you know that, you're developing a heart to want to push down those who compete with you. But instead, you, the Christian, you're not going to do it. You're going to, with as much as life within you, live at peace with everybody. That even means the competition. So it says, the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears attentive to their cry. The face of the Lord is against those who do evil, to cut off the memory of them from the earth. The righteous cry out, and the Lord hears them. He delivers them from all of their troubles. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. A righteous man may have many troubles, but the Lord delivers him from them all. And so the point here that I want to establish as we're looking at the life of David, David wasn't jealously looking at his next station in life. In fact, he was a shepherd boy and laboring on the other side of a mountain, not even close to the rest of his family where he could be recognized. But what we're going to find about David is he bloomed where he was planted. Wherever he was, he gave his best. And he learned many, many life lessons. But his teacher was God. And don't ever forget that. You can learn a lot of crafty things from God, from people. But you always learn righteous ways from the Lord. So he says, come, my children, listen to me. Let me teach you the ways of the Lord. So now, David is doing what he's called to do. He's a shepherd boy taking care of his father's sheep, and he's not even around the family as these events are about to take place. So it says, back to 1 Samuel chapter 16, He says, fill your horn with oil. God is talking to Samuel, the prophet. Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I'm sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king. Long before you rise to the level that God is taking you, you were chosen. It's one thing to be selected by men, but it's quite another to be chosen by God. So David, people saw him probably as a very minuscule person or player on the stage, but to God, he was looking at and shaping the next king of Israel. You won't see this in the story. Sometimes when you're reading it, you may not, or you may overlook some of those very small details. But those details are very important. David, we're not going to hear a lot about all that he was doing as a shepherd boy, but we'll see the results in his life. When he really needs faith, he'll already have it. When he really needs boldness, he'll already have it. When he really needs to lean on God and trust God, he'll already have it. These are developed before he becomes king. And remember, the you that seems to be labor in obscurity, and then there's the you who God elevates. I wonder if you'll change, and if you do, if it will be for the better. Now remember, blooming where you're planted has a couple of different ways to be looked at. One is, the Bible teaches us never to allow a root of bitterness to grow. Well, roots only grow with time and nurturing, just like any other plant. Roots need the same thing, roots of bitterness need the same thing as roots of fruit trees. And that is, they need to be watered and fertilized and nourished and nurtured. And see, one of the things we do is we can learn, because we feel overlooked, unseen, unnoticed, we could actually bloom, but that blooming will be weeds or roots of bitterness that will take a long time to pull out. And remember, sometimes you can pull up a weed and break and leave a little bit of the root and it comes back. That's why the Bible teaches not even a root of bitterness in you, God's son, God's daughter. So now we have back to 1 Samuel 16. In verse 2, but Samuel said, how can I go? Saul will hear about it and kill me. In other words, because Saul is king right now, or the competition, when he hears that there's someone else who might be somewhere behind him who could take his place, then that person behind him might be in a little trouble. But he says God gives Samuel a plan, but remember, sometimes the people who are above you are trying to suppress you, especially when they see your abilities sometimes. But remember, if you're doing it God's way, you don't have to worry about a thing. It's when you start to do it the ways of the world that you'll have a problem. So it says, the Lord said, take a heifer with you and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what to do. You are to anoint for me the one I indicate. So in other words, go to Jesse's house. This is not a lie or a scheme. He's saying when you go, you're going to offer a sacrifice. And at that sacrifice, you're going to point or anoint the person I tell you to anoint. See, Samuel doesn't even know. Only God knows. And sometimes in your life, you don't know the next step that God is about to take. But make sure, make absolute certainty that you're doing what's right in the eyes of God, because his eyes never wander away from you. His eye is always on you. And so as God is watching you in that process, he's preparing you. And sometimes we lengthen the process simply by being disobedient, simply by behaving like unbelievers. But David was nurturing his relationship with the Lord, didn't have a clue about what God was doing. But remember, you are in God's plan right now, whether you know it or not, whether you even think it or not. You're already in God's plan. You just may not see it happening or taking shape. But it is for David, and so it is for you. Then it says, Samuel did what the Lord said. When he arrived at Bethlehem, the elders of the town trembled. When they met him, they asked, "Do you come in peace?" Samuel replied, "Yes, in peace. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come to the sacrifice with me." Then he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. So now Samuel, being the obedient man of God that he was, he's now at the house of Jesse, who is David's father, because he's getting ready to anoint the next king. And you know the story, but I just love the text and the idea and the lessons that God teaches. Then it says in verse 6, when they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. Now, what that says is Samuel, in one of those moments, even though he was the prophet over Israel, in one of those moments, he did what everybody else does. They judge by outward appearance. Eliab, to him, looks like, hey, this guy has got to be the one. Tall in stature, maybe handsome, and all these different things that we look at from a worldly perspective. But what he's going to find out is something different about God. And remember, I told you, God's eyes are always on you. Now, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because I want to read something before we get to this next part. On that same line, verse 7, I want to read something else. Same chapter, 1 Samuel chapter 16. It says, in verse 8, I'll start. Then Jesse called Abinadab and had him pass in front of Samuel. But Samuel said, the Lord has not chosen this one either. And that's important. You know what? We're looking for God's anointed here. The Lord had not chosen this one either. Jesse then had Shammah pass by, but Samuel said, nor has the Lord chosen this one. Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, but Samuel said to him, the Lord has not chosen these. Well, then what? 7 of his sons has already passed in front of him. So God, what do you want me to do here? And then, but this is important. In the eyes of men, people, remember, we're trying to please God. David wasn't even considered. And you know, that's a feeling, an attitude can come from that. You're not even considering me? Well, man may not. But you see, those that men chose, God said, it's not one of them. And then Jesse and Samuel had a problem. The least likely, but the actual one that God had been nurturing and cultivating a relationship with, David, who was blooming where he was planted as a shepherd boy, keeping his father's sheep. Since that was his job, that's what he did. And he did it with all his heart. The sheep didn't pay because David was their shepherd who hated his job. In fact, we'll see later how David protected the sheep. David, in that little minuscule job, perhaps in the eyes of men, God had a king. And he took that little small job and he gave it his best. He did all that he knew to do. And so listen, it says this. Well, there is still the youngest, Jesse answered, but he is tending the sheep. Surely you're not talking about him. Surely you're not talking about him. And see, that's how life feels sometimes. It feels like you're just laboring in obscurity. Nobody notices, nobody cares, nobody gives any thought. But remember, and I'm going to focus on this probably again before I close, it's the eyes of the Lord that are watching you, is that you should be concerned about. Yeah, the eyes of men, we do what's right in both the eyes of God and man. But remember, it's God that we're looking to please. If you become a man pleaser, you may disappoint God. But if you become a God pleaser, you'll never fail with men. It's a very important point. So now, here's what God says. I'm going to go back now to a previous verse in 1 Samuel 16. It says in verse 7, but the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at things man looks at. Man looks at the outer appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Remember, guard your heart. It is the wellspring, it says in Proverbs 4. It is the wellspring of life. You see, it was the heart of this new king that God was looking at, not his outward appearance. Outward appearance is the methodology that people use. God looks at the heart. And what you're cultivating in your heart is going to be what shapes your heart. If you are bitter, if you're just frustrated with your life and you just can't stand the way things are, and you become this bitter person, you're not guarding your heart. He's talking about put a guard over your heart where you make sure that nothing goes in, nothing defiled remains there. Because God, he could care less about the outward appearance. It's the heart that he looks at. And so in this story, we find this very, very important point that all of us as men and women of God, the person, who we want to please most in life, first and foremost, is God. Because his eyes are always on you and his ears are always attentive to you. And so, David to them was a shepherd boy working on the backside of a mountain, taking care of sheep. However, to God, he was the next king of Israel. It says, moving back up in 1 Samuel 16, I'll start let's read verse 11 again. So he asked Jesse, are all these the sons you have? Are these all the sons you have? There is still the youngest, Jesse answered, but he is tending the sheep. Samuel said, send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives. So he sent and had him brought in. He was ruddy, with a fine appearance and handsome features. Yeah, he still looked good. It says, then the Lord said, rise, anoint him. He's the one. So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came upon David in power. Samuel then went to Ramah. We'll have to close right there today. Doesn't matter how everybody else saw David. They saw him as a shepherd, laboring in obscurity. Maybe someone who was never going to rise much further from that. But to God, that shepherd boy was the next king of Israel. Listen, enjoy your journey with the Lord. Do what's right wherever you are. Remember, it's God's eyes that are on you. It's God you're trying to please. You do that and you will be fine. God will take you places you probably never thought you would go. God will allow you and enable you to experience things you may never thought you would see or experience. Remember, God is not looking at the outer appearance. It's your heart. Guard it well. God bless you. Until next week, we'll see you.